Alrighty, I see there's been some very quick action in terms of people actually jumping online, so we will get started. Welcome everybody to the next in our 2021 AVERT webinar series. We are absolutely thrilled to have with us today Professor Tahir Abbas, who will be speaking to us, as you know, about Islamophobia, reciprocal radicalisation, and countering violent extremism. One of the reasons that we were so keen to ask Tahir to join us for this today is on the basis of his recent book, which is already generating a lot of really fruitful and productive discussion and debate in the field. So Associate Professor Tahir Abbas, for those of you who don't know him, is an Associate Professor at the Institute of Strategic and Global Affairs at Leiden University in The Hague, a long-term researcher on ethnicity, social conflict, Islamophobia and radicalisation. He has held many previous positions, including at RUSI, at Fatih University and Istanbul University of Birmingham and elsewhere. And his recent publications include Countering Violent Extremism with Bloomsbury, Islamophobia and Radicalisation with Hurst Oxford University Press a couple of years back, Contemporary Turkey in Conflict with Edinburgh University Press, and many more. So we are really looking forward to a stimulating, informative, I hope provocative discussion, as many of us are familiar with from Tahir's previous work. So just before Tahir gets going, a couple of very quick ground rules for the webinar. It is webinar format. So we would ask you, as Tahir is speaking, which will be for roughly between 30 to 40 minutes, as Tahir is speaking, please feel free to post any questions that come to mind as we're going in the Q&A using the little Q&A tab at the bottom. At the end of the session, we will then moderate those questions to give Tahir a chance to respond and to engage in some dialogue with the kinds of issues that people are raising in response to the presentation. If you're having any technical difficulties at any stage, please use the chat to contact us, and we will do our best behind the scenes to assist. And with that, over to you, Tahir.
Well, good morning from The Hague. Thank you, Michelle and Lydia, and all of you for the opportunity to take part in this webinar and to talk about some of the issues related to Islamophobia and countering violent extremism in today's world. A lot of these issues are relevant going forward for me and for the project that I'm leading on, called the DRIVE project, where we're looking at the role of social exclusion in the reciprocal radicalization of far-right and Islamist extremists, however we are defining those terms, in Northwest Europe. And we are at the stage of finalizing our research instruments, and we're going to go into the field hopefully by the end of October, all being well. I can very happily expand on some of that work and what we're trying to do, and I'll try to fuse in some of those ideas into what I want to do today. So what I want to do today is to talk about some of the themes that have emerged from two of my recent books. One that's looked at the relationship between Islamophobia and radicalization, which for me seems very much a no-brainer. If we provide constant rhetoric that is anti-Muslim, it's going to create tensions among disaffected Muslim minorities and disaffected ethnic majorities. And we've seen this play out routinely for the last 20 years, and there are indicators to suggest that this relationship goes on, although when we think about cumulative radicalization, it's less the idea of directly feeding off each other's hate, and more the idea of cumulative polarization, where there is a general overwhelming context in which the framing of the other goes on uncritically, in particular through media and political biases. I also want to talk about CVE, and this is interesting given that CVE has been on the lips of people working in this area for about 5 or 6 years, and here we are 20 years after the war on terror. Whether it still goes on or not, it's another question. The name has been dropped. We call it something else, but some of these activities around it remain the same. And yet we're still thinking about CVE in the way that we might have done a few years ago, which is state-centric, it's top-down, it presumes a general theory about what causes radicalization, and this has the impact of making a lot of the CVE interventions that go on quite ineffective. And in effect, they really are more the case of being community development, empowerment projects, rather than the idea that what we're doing to help young people to become better versions of themselves is somehow fighting extremism. Some of the entire language of countering violent extremism is inverted, it's back to front. A good example also is PREVENT, which is the UK flagship counter-terrorism, counter-extremism intervention, and yet it's deeply flawed and remains so despite all of the efforts made by the British government to sell it across the world. We've had 2 decades since the onset of the war on terror that began after the events of 9/11. And today, the CVE approach is still what was initiated after these events, when we had the Patriot Act, the initiation of the contest strategy in the UK. It's a state-centric approach. But the methodologies have adverse effects, including adding to stigmatization, Islamophobia, as well as fueling far-right and radical right sentiment that centers on anti-Muslim failing. The consequences of the current CVE paradigms are that they disproportionately focus on the problems of the ideological pull factors, while taking attention away from structural push factors that habitually underpin the realities of extremism across the world. More crucially, the opportunity to critique the space that is domestic and foreign policy in this area is limited to such an extent that there are, in the case of the UK legislation introduced to prevent dissent, effectively, street protests, and even journalists reporting on leaked material from government. It could land them into a lot of trouble. So we've had a lot of interest and investment in countering violent extremism since 2001. Governments, academia, civil society organizations continue to struggle with finding ways forward. But there are difficulties around delivering sustainable solutions because of rapid developments, globalization, localization, economic inequality, political polarization due to the hollowing out of the center ground politically, as well as the rise of issues such as populism, authoritarianism, and nationalism have created new challenges. All the while, terrorist acts succeed and they are thwarted. But while much emphasis is placed on trying to find the reasons for these problems and the solutions, we're still struggling to find a systematic approach that remains consistent. And this is because there are no straightforward explanations of extremism and radicalization. There is no one single factor that can be isolated as the explanatory variable. And so, again, it's back to the assumptions or the presumptions on the part of governments around what causes the issues of extremism that are essentially the real reasons why we still have ineffectiveness and inefficiency and potentially significant damage. And so what we need is a critical, grounded, community-directed attention to detail that moves beyond the cursory notion that terrorists are dissimilar from the rest of society. We also have a problem with conceptualization. Radicalization means very different things depending on who the audience is and who the speaker is. But anything we might call radicalization occurs in a social context. It doesn't occur in a vacuum. But there is a much needed discussion and debate on the wider societal dimensions of radicalization, extremism, and political violence that remains missing in policy development. Although in the academy, we tend to be a little bit fairer to this particular part of the equation. So I want to talk about a few things here. I want to talk about the need to deconstruct historical and social structures that lead to extremism. We need to understand and redefine perhaps even how we understand radicalization and de-radicalization, because some radicalization is actually a force for good. We need to look at the societal normalization of Islamophobia and what that has meant for the discussion on Muslims in general. And we have to look at wider perspectives on some of the individual level triggers that are relevant in our understanding of extremism, which in this case refer to mental health issues. We've created a set of industries to do with radicalization, de-radicalization, and CVE, and yet we are still puzzling over issues of cause and effect. So indeed, the war on terror began 20 years ago. And while the language has shifted, the idea of a perpetual conflict against terror and terrorism in Europe, in particular, and across the global north and global south in general, is considered normal. But today's terrorism concerns itself with many more conundrums, namely the far right and the all right, and also incels, which have come to our attention more and more. But underpinning most cases are the realities of younger and in some cases older people who are facing various issues of social exclusion, and including mental health concerns, which are now beginning to be taken seriously. Indeed, the issue of social exclusion and mental health concerns were problems affecting Muslim minorities throughout the European experience over the last 2 decades, but they were invisible to policymakers until recently. Policymakers were hell-bent on the idea that we need to moderate the religion, work with the sharp end of the problems, and everything else will fall into line. And while this 20-year period has gone on with the war on terror, in the background, in the foreground has come about Islamophobia, historically embedded Orientalism, which is effectively what it is. It predates the war on terror, but it is now even stronger than it was before its acceleration 2 days ago. Today's everyday Islamophobia feeds off well-projected, commonly held racialist and culturalist tropes about Muslims. But there are also issues to do with specific considerations around social media, mainstream politics, and everyday popular culture that normalizes anti-Muslim sentiment, not just in Europe, but across the world today. If we think back to terminology, we've seen the rapid spread of radicalization, but its meaning is still contested. Many have, Mark Sedgwick referred to it as a source of confusion. Others call it a buzzword used by political elites and so-called specialists, but proves to be, quote, a total nightmare to operationalize as a topic for research. Lacks scientific rigor, it is argued by others, plagued by assumption, intuition, and conventional Western wisdom. And other critics emphasize that it stresses individual and psychological processes, consequently placing too great an emphasis on ideological and theological interpretations at the expense of social and political considerations. Islamist radicalization is portrayed as a virus that spreads rapidly, precluding any detailed explanation of the developments, of the precise developments that occur from forming beliefs to seemingly committing violent acts because of those beliefs, if such a relationship can be articulated at all. And the recent critical turn in radicalization studies also highlights the negative effect of the discourses in terms of securitization, depoliticization, and the construction of suspect communities through the racialization of the stereotypical Muslim. Dangerous Brown Men is the title of a book by Gargi Bhattacharya, which reflects on the idea of men who were seen in the UK in the 1980s, South Asian men, still seen as Asian men, as weak, pliable, obey the law, stay out of trouble, almost feminized. But the hyper-masculine characterization of the angry Muslim man today reflects also the shift in Islamophobia in this particular direction. So the term radicalization has proven unsatisfactory and it needs reframing. But there is no universal theory of radicalization, and often much of this theorization is without empirical context at all. And back to the state-centric approach, which in itself is seen as justification for CVE. It's based on the claims of the likelihood of radicalization as a function of inherent group or individual characteristics. We never really get to discuss issues of post-colonialism, race, gender, or class. The sensitive issues relating to the questions of power, representation, and participation in society are written out due to the top-down policy agenda. Let's explore a couple of hypotheticals. Consider the cases of young Moroccan men from the Netherlands who are implicated in these kinds of problems, and young Pakistani men from the UK who find themselves also implicated. So in thinking through de-radicalization, whatever we mean by that, we might celebrate the idea of any young man who has reversed their radicalization and sought greater comfort in their position as a citizen of society, viewing the possibility of greater participation as a solution to their self-isolation or exclusion. But while we can consider CVE perhaps operating at this level, it pays little heed to the wider implications of being a Muslim minority in the Netherlands or in the UK today. Nor does it consider the numerous existential realities that create mental health problems, as well as a sense of malaise due to the general experience of vilification and marginalization. Exclusionary factors as these limit the participation of individuals in society, not their regressive understandings of particular religious or theological perspectives. Society itself excludes individuals in significant ways. And again, I'm referring to the marginalized, the alienated, who are Muslim minority in the case of the Islamist extremism question, but also the white majority youths who are also finding themselves in precarious situations where their idea of themselves has been beaten out of them effectively because of a sense of a lack of opportunity or participation and engagement. And so they are easily then exploitable by the ideologues who can provide all sorts of stimuli, and including in some cases income. We have to realize that a lot of people who joined the Islamic State did so because it was a job, and some are within the far right are recruiting disaffected young men, majority men, because they're offering them forms of employment. So this focus on ideology is convenient. It helps to capture a problem in a neat sort of box rather than seeing everything as much more intricate and complex. And it's suitable for policymakers because it takes attention away from failings of domestic policy, i.e. integration, equality, diversity, inclusion in general, and takes attention away from foreign policy. And as we've seen in Afghanistan, it's one set of bad decisions followed by another. And these have numerous implications. When we watched those scenes on our television screens on September 11th, 2001, it was one of those moments when we obviously try to remember where we were and what we were doing at the time. But I remember very much of the view that this was going to be pretty disastrous for the Muslim world. At the time, it wasn't clear what was exactly going on, but if it was the case that so-called Muslims were behind it, this would mean significant implications. Not just in the global north as minorities, but also majorities in the global south. And we've seen this occur before our eyes. Fast forward to today, we've seen the securitization of Muslims through the normalization of Islamophobia. For example, through legislation that hinders Muslim women's cultural and religious expression. We have minaret bans in Europe. We have cartoons mocking significant Muslim religious symbols for mocking's sake. And digital surveillance is now the new normal, whether it is online or through the eyes of face recognition cameras everywhere. The war on terror has normalized the securitization of societies and regularized the existence of Islamophobia. This has increased the likelihood of radicalization and not reduced it. In terms of foreign policy, there are still ongoing questions. Afghanistan is mired in complex, multifaceted conflicts that had much to do with the presence of external actors. 20 years on, as the US and its allies have left the country, the Taliban have returned to absolute power. We don't know where exactly it's headed. We don't exactly know the implications it would create for the region, for its neighbors, but we know that it's a very different Taliban, and obviously there's a lot that's still remaining to unfold here. But the eyes of the world are watching very closely as to what happens next. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, motivated by a geostrategic interest in the Middle East, with the non-existent weapons of mass destruction used as a justification, caused Iraq to descend into chaos once invaded, with the contagion still infecting Syria to this day. It became the antecedent to the emergence of the so-called Islamic State just over a decade after 9/11, who were initially funded and supported by US, by the allies in the region who were facilitating a sort of a Sunni resistance movement to help fight against Assad. And we know historically all of the different players involved in facilitating that. But it got out of hand, and it became another beast. And we saw what the Islamic State did, and the horrors that it inflicted onto the people of the region. But without a doubt, if we think of the war on terror as beginning at the events of 9/11 and think about where we are in terms of seeing the events unfold in Afghanistan, we can almost certainly agree that it's been an unmitigating disaster, but one that was predictable at the outset, because the war on Afghanistan was motivated by revenge, supported by unrestrained weaponry. And the fall of Kabul in August 2021 is reminiscent of the fall of Saigon in 1975. Although the Vietnam War was a far more expensive affair for the US economy, which had significant implications for the economy itself. But it reflects the fact that it was another war that was lost. So overall, trying to kind of contextualize all of this, preventing and countering violent extremism, or its precursor, the more nebulous term de-radicalization, put the cart before the horse. The essential assumption is that Islamist radicalization and violent extremism come from within the religion. So if we limit the effects of the ideological pull of extremism, there will be less likelihood of young Muslims the world over joining organizations and taking part in spreading hate or spreading violent extremist behavior. Such an approach takes agency away from individual and group actors whose motivations may well be more to do with their perceptions and experiences related to the idea of seeking justice, recognition, or having no choice but to respond to violence with violence. Rather than seeing violence to do with the abuses of power at the hands of individuals, governments, or even corporate interests, radicalization is seen to be a function of those who follow a religion that is seen as rigid at best. Dogmatic, uncompromising, promoting violence are also the veneers that can be seen here, and these are reflective of the age of Islamophobia. The misconception of radicalization increases Islamophobia, which then has the knock-on effect of increasing radicalization. Throughout this time, and since the events of 9/11, state actors continue to look at the religion for the answers. So efforts are made to delegitimize certain interpretations. The idea of breaking down what we think of as jihad with references to Islamic poetry using stratcoms, strategic communications, or alternative narratives, as it were, to combat online content, to deal with the harms before people get to click their way to it. But while considerable investment has gone into this, it has limited measurable impact. And it's arguably because the strategy has been wrong all along. It's arguably because it's assuming that there is a particular religious pull that takes people to places of vulnerability to violence. Now, it's not to dismiss that pull element throughout this process, but it's just to emphasize that when it does occur, it occurs at the absolute latter stages, not at the very beginning, which is again the assumption. And while a lot of the people who end up being pushed into extremism do so from alienated, marginalized backgrounds with weak critical thinking, those who do the pulling, as it were, are indeed the ideologues who are very strong-minded, even if they're dogmatic in their approaches. So there are different types of people here that we need to emphasize, but it's the weak and the vulnerable and the susceptible who are the majority, and the very few who are the ideologues. They are often well known to the authorities. And when it came to previous cases of counterterrorism, a lot of the work done here is in the background. Although the London Islam thesis in the 1990s complicates matters, in that the security services were actively acknowledging and instrumentalizing the presence of radicalizing forces in London in order to act as a honeypot thesis, basically to keep an eye on them, to be able to keep an eye on the circle, the orbit that circles around these individuals, has to have a better handle on counterterrorism per se. And I think that episode in history has resulted in mixed results and assessments of those results. So agency is limited. Agency is taken away. The idea of individuals being proactive, even the idea of signing up to an extremist group is an expression of agency of sorts. But all of that agency is completely delegitimized. We also have to understand, though, the material reality, the material conditions facing a lot of the vulnerable who end up on these paths. We know that there are cases, as mentioned earlier, of the far right providing unemployed, frustrated young men jobs with income to mobilize them as actors to help spread the ease. As mentioned earlier, the number of people who joined Islamic State because they offered a job. If you could speak French and Arabic and use Movie Maker on a MacBook Pro, you could gain an even better salary working for the Islamic State. And all the promises that came with that hijrah that people made, obviously many were disappointed and frustrated. A lot tried to leave but could not. And of course, we have the tragedy of the women and the children who are stuck in camps where no state really wants them back. So overall, we have a protracted policy development landscape. The dominant CVE policy agenda has taken the experiences of specific individuals and framed a popular narrative around the idea that an ideological awakening appears among young men and a few women who have anxieties over identity and belonging. However, this generalization is too broad. It only concentrates on ideology as a pull factor. It does not explore the push factors that take people along a path that allows for easy exploitation. And in the cases of young people who end up going through processes of being radicalized and then de-radicalized successfully, we don't always know of their full backstory or their personal life issues that may or may not have had a role to play. We don't know much about the wider social context in which their identities were shaped. But at the same time, we also understand that it takes a considerable effort for a person to arrive at the situation. Otherwise, we would see many more young, disaffected, alienated, marginalized, excluded young men taking a path to extremism. A lot of it is to do with the fact that the online space is so surveilled and Muslim minorities feel so securitized that it prevents them from wanting to go out and find out more even. But there's definitely a case of people who should be able to look at information online without the worry that it could lead them to being arrested potentially. We also have cases of known understandings now around the mental health dimension here. Schizophrenia, ADHD, Asperger's, and all other illnesses are routinely found. We find that in the case of prevent referrals today, that a lot of this is about the mental health issues coming to the fore. And this is, again, something that authorities are now looking at much more sensitively, because it's the far right cases that are coming to the fore much more into the prevent system in the last few years. When it was the Muslims who were being processed at far greater rates than was necessary, because you have to be referred once your case can be fully assessed, and most of the time those cases were dropped. But mental health was not seen as such an issue, and yet we understand now that it's always been an issue. And there are always going to be individual level triggers that help us to connect what's happening between the spaces between the push factors and the pull factors. And this is where the DRIVE project is hopefully trying to better understand that while we've got social exclusion as a given, that we understand that we're looking at people who are facing exclusionary issues around health, employment, education, housing, for example. We also know that there has to be something at the level of the individual that triggers a path that's trodden, that ends up potentially in violence. And this is to do with mental health. And what we want to try and do with the DRIVE project is to introduce public mental health understandings. Another topic that is interesting is the case of returning foreign fighters and their children. Now, a great deal of emphasis is placed on the idea that they were damaged before they left, and that they are further damaged due to their experiences in Iraq, Syria, and that there will be a significant security threat to the country upon their return, if they do return. And again, it is not sensitive to the realities, to the trauma, to the individual suffering and exploitation that many of these people may well have gone through, including the fact that a lot of young women were effectively trafficked, groomed into taking part in this journey to the Islamic State and being married off to people as almost as if they were cattle. Sadly, we saw the exploitation of the Yazidi women and those videos as well. So there was a lot of hypermasculinity around all of that for sure. But okay, if we think that we're interested in bringing back these mothers and children from these camps in Iraq, that's certainly a noble intervention, and it's certainly relevant because these are individuals who are still citizens, although in some cases their citizenship has been revoked. But if we're thinking about reintegrating them back, what are we reintegrating them back into? If we know that part of the reason for their wanting to leave was that they were dissatisfied with their experiences in society, not because of a particular ideological pull necessarily, but more the reality of the everyday exclusionary discourses that feed into the lived experiences of Muslim minorities, adding to stress and anxiety and pressure that can ultimately cause people to seek alternative solutions, and in some cases beyond their borders. But we still don't know what we want people to reintegrate back into, yet we know that we think that reintegration is the right thing to do. And it's the same with prisoners who have been radicalized and gone to prison and were de-radicalized in prison. And then we want to reintegrate them back into society. Almost all cases of successful reintegration include material investment, jobs, upskilling, getting people ready to feel that they have a role and a stake in life so they can be a participatory citizen with a stake that otherwise would have been denied to them. So we need to think about returning foreign fighters, their children, the widows, and that means building solutions with the necessary tools, cultural competencies, professional practices, as well as sensitivities around understanding the human condition. And a lot more work is going to be needed on that, as well as the legal dimension, which remains sensitive. More and more European countries are making greater efforts to bring their citizens back, and this will have a spillover effect elsewhere. But right now, there seems to be quite a bit of resistance to it. We must understand that this lack of this idea of reintegration, whether it's foreign fighters, their wives, their widows, their children, or prisoners, needs us to consider carefully about what they're going to be reintegrating into and what the implications would be for perhaps going back into the co-ethnic communities in particular neighborhoods. What would that do for their sense of inclusion there? And if we are thinking of rehousing them elsewhere, what does that mean for, but they're potentially being labeled in certain ways, and their security and safeguarding in those particular areas. Okay, so I've realized I've gone on a bit. Let me just try and conclude here to say that we have parallel processes of issues of Islamophobia and radicalization. That is, Islamophobia with all the structural and cultural factors that have the genealogy in Orientalism and neo-colonial ideas, which have been accelerated since the war on terror. Radicalization isn't just about the idea of being tipped into violence by some notion of pulled into ideology, but there are many, many push factors which are related to Islamophobia in the sense of the exclusionary material realities facing young people. And this radicalization can also occur, this Islamophobia can also create radicalization among the far right. And we know that, for example, in Luton, which is sort of market town outside of London, the birthplace of al-Majroon is also the birthplace of the EDL, and the EDL was effectively a counter jihad movement. So
you're just frozen there for a minute, Tahir, so we'll hope that you come back online in a moment. Hi, everyone. We seem to have lost Tahir momentarily. Obviously the connection cut out. So if you can bear with us, we'll hope that he will be rejoining us very shortly. So don't go, stay tuned. Okay, we're still waiting for Tahir Abbas to rejoin the call, and hopefully he'll be able to do that in order to take up some of the really interesting questions that people have already been posting. So I would encourage you, while we're waiting for Tahir to rejoin us, to continue thinking about any questions that you might have, paste them right into the Q&A, and even though we've obviously lost a few minutes of time here, we'll do our best to here he is again, to be able to get to all of them. Hi, Tahir, if you're there.
Hello. Hi.
Welcome back. Welcome back.
I'm sorry about that. I have no idea what happened, and I don't know how far I got either with the talk.
You were just in the last, I think, minute or so of your concluding remarks.
Okay, good. Oh, well, I think that was it then, essentially. And I'm glad I got that far. For some reason, I can't start my video, but
You should be able to.
Oh, no, there you are.
Okay, so apologies, folks, for what happened there at the end. Hopefully you got the vast majority of all of that. And at the end, I was just trying to say that we've got parallel issues to think about: Islamophobia feeding off radicalization, radicalization feeding off Islamophobia, and that the CVE sort of approach still remains back to front.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Tahir. This has been an incredibly rich and stimulating presentation, with lots and lots to discuss and lots to think about. And we do already have quite a wide range of questions, which I'm now going to start going through to give you a chance to respond. So the first question focuses really on the critique that you've offered of radicalization as both a conceptual and operational term. And the questioner is asking, given the problems that you've identified conceptually and operationally with radicalization as a framework, are we now seeing a shift towards extremism as the new conceptual operational paradigm? If we are, what are the implications of this new paradigm, both for the persistence or abatement of Islamophobia specifically, but also for the task of understanding the dynamics of terrorism and violent extremism more broadly?
Oh, that's a good question, because I remember in discussions with the government and ministers in the early 2000s, we were talking about how to define these issues. And we thought, extremism is okay. In fact, we need a bit of extremism. I'm extremely generous. I'm extremely kind. Nothing wrong with a bit of extremism. But it's when it's violent, then obviously it's a criminal matter, and it has implications that require redressing. Now, there is a shift, and that's because of the political climate around what we're facing in the global north and in the south. This authoritarianism, this populism, this lack of acceptance of expertise, the credibility normally afforded to academics is chucked out the window. We're seen as troublemakers. Our content in terms of university curricula is questioned. We're seen as lefty troublemakers on campuses, etc. So there's a lot of shifting of the framing of what extremism is because of the wider political context. And so yes, it's a dangerous path. And essentially, because one of the sort of inherent ideas I want to be able to try and induce is that you need to reclaim radicalization away from the state-centric top-down approach, and see that actually the radicalization in many respects can be a healthy outcome of social democracies, liberal democracies everywhere, and that these are necessary precursors for social change more often than not. But because of the state-centric top-down, yes, the risks are there, and we can see it's already converging on the idea of not just countering violent extremism, but countering extremism per se. And we see that also with legislation that prevents street protests, basically. I mean, in response to the Black Lives Matter, the government has decided to curtail further protests. I mean, rather than listen and learn, it's just silence people.
Okay, you mentioned sort of a kind of censure in terms of being considered, lefty sort of troublemakers, and this goes directly to the next question asked by one of the webinar's participants. Do you think that a left populism, which is to say, channeling discontent and conflict in positive ways, can actually be an effective form of politics to counter radical and extremist views, particularly in terms of as an alternative in mobilizing the emotions of people who are now drawn to nativist and authoritarian forms of politics?
In short, yes. In short, yes, because that implies inclusion, participation, engagement, a sense of citizenry that is often denied to people who want to protest, who don't trust the state, who are disengaged, and so we will need to reverse these kinds of politics rather than picking out the extremists and then extending the label of what we mean by extremism as such. It's again, a lot of this is the other way around. We want to be thinking about inclusion in the broader sense, and that implies participation and engagement, and that just is not happening. And of course, with COVID, and in the UK with Brexit also, there are going to be more problems ahead, and more dissent and more protests. The government have just gone ahead and instead of preparing for that, they've decided to silence people in advance.
In what sense silence them in advance?
Well, prevent them from potentially reporting on leaked government papers. I mean, journalists can get up to 10 years if you are now reporting on a leaked document from a parliamentarian. That is a real issue. And also the street protests. So these Black Lives Matter protests that we saw, those could be deemed illegal, and people could be arrested for taking part in them. And what was Black Lives Matter about? It was frustration well, almost in every city of the US and across the world, a frustration that's been long in the making, and where often there isn't very much legitimate avenues to make those frustrations heard. And even these protests are now going to be securitized.
The next question is working on the basis of a thesis that radicalization plays off two emotions, or two affective experiences, one being a superiority complex and the other being fear of the other, and that these two feed off each other. And the questioner is asking, how might these dynamics be addressed with men at a young age, particularly, say, during school years, in an era when both hypermasculinity and vibrant feminism is presenting conflicting messages to them?
Yeah, this is what the incels are on about. Their biggest gripe is women who now have power and status that they don't. And so there's something about an unreconstructed patriarchy that still lingers in society. While we see rapid progress in terms of women in the labor market and participation, representation, etc., we see men who have not been able to catch up with all of that progress, as it were. And so their frustrations have resulted in this case, in the case of the incels, against violence, or violence against women. And this is all very tragic. So there are so many issues there around gender norms and how we think about masculinity and femininity, and where to begin. It begins at the level of the home. It's what's in our education curricula. It's in terms of the societal norms we create around gender. And we see rapid progress, and this rapid progress has led to an unevenness and an imbalance that has led to frustrations for men and women. And I think that's probably fair to say. But some men in particular have been unable to have the support, all the structures around them to work through this and to come out of it as reconstructed men, as it were, but men who remain effective. And I think there are some real issues there. And I think it's just because things have been so rapid in the last few years, and we haven't quite caught up.
Okay. The next question is focusing on some of your analysis in relation to the role of social exclusion and material conditions in radicalization trajectories, and asking what kinds of interventions do you think are needed at the current moment to create greater social inclusion? And this questioner is referencing some work going on in another Horizon 2020 project, The Brave, which is looking at violent extremism, polarization, and that intersection of social, economic, historical, and grassroots elements. So what should we do?
Well, there's a lot to do. There's a lot to do. I mean, there's a very large shopping list, which requires billions in terms of investment and infrastructure and what is routinely called leveling up, because we have such inequality within countries, between regions, and that is systematic and fundamental, and it requires, I say, billions. But at the softer end of interventions, we can still work within local community settings, and it starts with the basics around building trust and building a sense of a role in society. And we know also from the Brave project, from the DARE project, if you bring together angry, disaffected young people who are from different backgrounds, put them in a room together, and they talk to each other, it irons out many differences. It starts to people build a human picture rather than what they see elsewhere, and it builds a sense of empathy and interaction. So our spaces in a lot of communities are so cut off from each other, sometimes by design, sometimes this housing segregation outcomes that we see today are because of pretty dodgy policy from going back to the 60s and 70s. And sometimes it's because of gatekeepers in housing markets. But ultimately, we find patches of communities who are separated from each other, and the narrative around it all doesn't exist. And 20 years ago, we might have had positive ideas about multiculturalism with its high, this is pre 9/11, with its high watermark around diversity as an asset. We should consider it favorably in all times. We build legislation that is there to ensure equality, etc. 20 years later, multiculturalism is seen as a kind of dirty word. It's seen as a problem and a risk to security even. So there's a lot to reverse and undo. And I try to think about what has worked well in the last 2 decades or so. And a lot of what was working well was just before the events of 9/11. And on the back of that, and then the question on the long shopping list was that it was a huge public investment, by stealth, of course, because New Labour didn't want to upset its partners in the private sector. But it invested heavily in health, education, on all sectors of education, but by stealth. And that led to some ideas of leveling up and a sense of participation. But we're so far away from that. We're so unequal, even as Western liberal democracies. And we have so many problems within societies internally around the political and the economic, that when it comes to radicalization, I think it's way down on the agenda of political policymakers. And when it is on the agenda, it's to do with quick fix solutions because of tomorrow's headlines, more often than not.
And so to a certain extent, you're painting a picture there of cumulative polarization running directly alongside cumulative inequalities, yeah?
Yes.
And the interaction between the two. In some ways, what you've just said relates to another question here, which is what, if anything, has changed in the way that we approach and that states approach radicalization. So this question is asking about the reframing of PREVENT, specifically in terms of safeguarding, and advancing the proposition that arguably PREVENT that the safeguarding paradigm has provided a more agentic role for communities. For example, rather than we're coming to get you, it's moved to care and concern, offering care and concern for those who are vulnerable to joining extremist movements, preferably from a prevent point of view through interacting, with prevent referrals and support systems. So, has this made a difference? Has this been a genuine effort to try to repeal some of the damage that you've referred to in previous iterations, or has it not really achieved, has it not really reflected a significant change?
I mean, it's an attempt to try and do exactly that, which is to just limit the damage of the connotations of prevent. But it's still similar in the sense that it's suggesting that there's a problem that you have, and this is a problem that you have to deal with. And here's a new language for you to deal with your problems, and a little bit of funny money, and off you go. It doesn't take away the idea that actually, as a government, as a state, we have a role to work together with you to try and understand the bigger picture and the smaller pictures together. There seems to be also similar concerns here in the Dutch context, when there's quite a lot of heavy connotation around Salafism and Salafist mosques, and the 50 Salafist mosques in the Netherlands that have been funded by X, Y, and Z. And yet it's a lot of paranoia, a lot of fear, a lot of misdirection. And it takes attention away from the role of the state and from the role of political elites in shaping the discourses and ultimately the material realities that face a lot of ordinary people.
Okay. The next question, which I'm afraid, given the time, and if with your indulgence and the indulgence of our participants, we might just go a couple of minutes over to give you a chance to answer this final question. This questioner is asking whether you think ideology plays any role at all. Okay, yes. So it's kind of asking you to elaborate on your thesis that there's been an overemphasis on ideology. Aren't ideas important, asks this question, in shaping attitudes, beliefs, values that will affect relationships with the state and society, and also affect responses to whatever alienation or discrimination or exclusion people may experience?
Ideology is important for the individuals who need a particularly narrow interpretation of certain texts in order to take them into a particular realm. Now, we assume that there are these kinds of standard paths. We assume that it's linear. Sometimes we think that religion is just some kind of psychological defect. For some, religion is significant. It is of real value to people who are believers and their practices and so on. So we have to understand that for what it is. When it comes to religion and ideology, when it comes to extremism, if people, you see, it's the understanding of the religion that's sometimes limited for a lot of people who think that they can narrowly select some ideological interpretations and see that as justification. The ideologues know exactly what they're doing to manipulate those vulnerable and uneducated minds. Most Muslims, even if they're sympathetic to perhaps the Taliban taking over, sympathetic to the idea of an emirate for Muslims, they will not seek to join it or limit what they do in their context, whether it's in Australia or Europe, because they gain certain advantages and positive values from that experience. What I'm trying to say is that you can't ignore ideology, because people who are hell-bent on killing others because of some ideological understanding, people have that and they've arrived at that. But how they get there is not necessarily because ideologies pull them. It's everything else that's taken to push somebody to believe that this is believable. And that is nothing to do with religion and theology or ideology. It's to do with a lot of factors of psychological, individual, material, political that have ended up in this sort of heady mix for one individual that's tipped them over into violence based on a particular ideological justification that they have determined. So we can work with this radicalization bag without going anywhere near ideology. In fact, I'm very much of the view that can be done, and I think a lot of examples can suggest that too.
Okay, you're pardon me, you're reminding me that this is also Mark Sageman's argument, which is that ideology meets people at a fair point down the road when they've already embarked on that journey. Tahir, there are a heap of other questions that we're not going to get to, and I apologize to participants in the webinar. They're all great questions, but we've just run out of time. Thank you so much. This has been, we could have gone for easily for another hour. This has been a really stimulating, informative, and very useful, good to think with, a number of the issues that you've raised and the analysis that you've offered. Thank you for your generosity and spending time with us this afternoon, and we hope we can do it again with you sometime.
Thank you, Michelle.
Okay.
Thank you, colleagues, and all the very best. Thank you.
And the best to you. Thanks, everybody. Good night now, or good morning.